The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Harriet Alden had packed everything she owned into a single carpet bag and boarded a westbound train that smelled of coal smoke and other people's hope. She had not been desperate, exactly. That was what she told herself as the Illinois flatlands blurred past the soot-streaked window, and the conductor called out stops she had never heard of and would never see again. She had been practical. There was a difference, she believed, between a woman who married out of desperation and a woman who married out of clear-eyed necessity. And Harriet had always prided herself on clarity of thought even when her heart was running ahead of her mind like a spooked horse. The advertisement had appeared in the Chicago Tribune on a cold January morning in 1878, wedged between a notice for horsehair mattresses and a quarter-page announcement about a traveling medicine show. It read, in neat and careful script, "Rancher in Cutter's Creek, New Mexico Territory, seeks a wife of good character and sound constitution. Must be willing to work alongside a man who works hard and means well. Correspondence welcomed. Inquire to C. Slater, Box 44, Cutter's Creek Post Office." C. Slater had replied to her first letter within 2 weeks. His handwriting was blocky and earnest, the pen pressing hard into the paper as though the words needed to be nailed down to stay true. He wrote that he ran cattle on 300 acres east of the Pecos River, that he was 31 years old, that he had a dog named Duke, and a habit of rising before the sun because he liked the way the desert went purple before the light came in. He wrote that he was a man of few words in person, but that he found it easier to say things on paper, and he hoped she would not hold that against him. Harriet had read that letter 4 times. Then she had written back. Their correspondence lasted 3 months. 6 letters from him, 7 from her, because she had written twice in February when February had been so cold in Chicago that she had found herself thinking about the New Mexico desert with something dangerously close to longing. By March, they had agreed on the terms. By April, she was on the train. She was 24 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up in the sensible way her mother had taught her, gray eyes that people sometimes called blue depending on the light, and hands that were already roughened from years of taking in laundry to supplement the schoolteacher's salary that was never quite enough. She was not a romantic. She had decided long ago. She was a practical woman who was going west to marry a practical man, and they would build a practical life together, and that would be enough. She was wrong about almost all of it. The train deposited her in Santa Fe on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, and from there she took a stagecoach that rattled and bounced for 2 days through country so vast and so alien that she pressed her face against the window and felt something inside her chest loosen in a way she could not quite explain. The sky was enormous here. In Chicago, the sky had always been a narrow thing, sliced up by buildings and elevated rail lines and the general business of a city that never stopped moving. Out here, the sky went on forever in every direction, deep blue shading toward violet at the edges, and the red rock formations rose up from the earth like the ruins of some ancient cathedral that had never been finished. Cutter's Creek was smaller than she had imagined. It had a main street that was barely a quarter-mile long, a general store, a saloon with a piano that someone was playing badly when the stage pulled in, a sheriff's office with a crooked door, a livery stable, and a church whose white paint was peeling in long strips as though the heat were trying to undress it. Dust hung in the air like a permanent condition. The afternoon sun was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on the crown of her head and made her grateful for the brim of her traveling hat. She climbed down from the stage with her carpet bag and stood in the street and looked around, and that was when she saw him. He was leaning against the post of the general store, one boot crossed over the other, arms folded, watching the stage with the patient attention of a man who had been waiting, but was not bothered by the waiting. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair pushed back beneath a dusty hat and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He was wearing a work shirt the color of pine needles and trousers that had seen serious work, and his eyes, when they found her, were a shade of brown so warm and so steady that she felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet. He pushed off the post and came toward her, and she thought, "All right, then. All right." "Miss Alden," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like water moving over smooth stones. "I'm Chester Slater." She put out her hand the way she had rehearsed in her mind, businesslike and composed. "Mr. Slater, it's good to meet you in person." He shook her hand carefully, as though she were something that might be damaged, and she noticed that his grip was warm and dry and very certain. "Good to meet you too," he said. "You must be tired. Stage road's not easy." "I've managed worse," she said, and he smiled at that, and she thought the smile changed his whole face, softened it in some way that made her feel oddly off balance. He took her carpet bag without asking, which she normally would have objected to, but something in the ease of the gesture made it feel less like presumption and more like simple courtesy, and she found she did not mind. He led her to a wagon waiting at the edge of the street, hitched to a pair of sturdy bays, and handed her up with the same careful attention he had given her handshake. They drove out of Cutter's Creek in the golden hour before sunset, and the land opened up around them into something so beautiful it almost hurt. The Pecos ran in a dark ribbon to the east, lined with cottonwoods that were just beginning to leaf out in pale green. The ranch appeared after about 20 minutes of driving, a main house built of adobe with a wide covered porch, a barn painted red that had faded to the color of old brick, corrals where a dozen horses moved in the late light, and a windmill that turned slowly in the warm evening air. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. He glanced at her sideways as though checking whether she was simply being polite. "Gets into you," he said. "The land takes a while, but it does." They ate supper at a table in the kitchen that was simple and good. He had clearly made an effort, because the beans were seasoned better than bachelor cooking usually managed, and there was fresh cornbread and a small jar of peach preserves that seemed to have come from the general store's best shelf. They were careful with each other over the meal, the way two people are when they are simultaneously strangers and not strangers, when there is already a kind of intimacy in the letters that has not yet been matched by actual knowledge of the person sitting across the table. She asked him about the ranch. He asked her about Chicago. She said she would not miss the winters. He said he had never seen a winter that bad and counted himself lucky. She asked about Duke, the dog mentioned in his letters, and he looked genuinely pleased that she had remembered, and the old hound ambled in from somewhere and laid his chin on her knee as though they had known each other for years. That night, he showed her to the room he had prepared for her, which was neat and spare, and had a quilt on the bed that she suspected had been folded and refolded at least twice that day. He told her there was no hurry about anything, which she took to mean about the wedding and about the more intimate aspects of a married life, and she appreciated the decency of it. They would get married in the church in town on Saturday. That had been agreed in the letters. She lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the desert, which were nothing like Chicago's sounds. Out here, the silence had texture. A coyote called somewhere in the distance. The windmill made its slow turning sound. The night was enormous and she was very small inside it, but for the first time in a long time, small did not feel like a bad thing. It felt like relief. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and went out to the porch, and found that the desert sunrise was exactly what Chester had described in his letters. Purple first, then pink, then a sudden flood of gold that made everything look like it had been struck into being fresh that very moment. She stood with her coffee cup and watched it, and when she heard a boot on the porch boards behind her, she said without turning, "You were right about the mornings." There was a pause, a beat too long, and then a voice said, "Glad to hear it." The voice was Chester's, but something in it was different, and when she turned, she understood why. The man standing in the doorway was not Chester Slater. He was Chester Slater in almost every particular. The same dark hair, the same jaw, the same broad shoulders. The same boots, very nearly the same hat. But his eyes were different, though they were the same color. They were warmer if that was possible, and there was something alive in them, something flickering and restless that Chester's steady gaze had not contained. And he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name, something between surprise and something else that she did not have the vocabulary for yet. "You're not Chester," she said. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm Caleb, Chester's brother." He paused. "His twin." She stared at him. The coffee cup was warm in her hands, and she held it tightly because it seemed important to hold on to something. "His twin," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Identical near enough." He seemed uncomfortable. "Chester didn't mention me." She thought about the 6 letters. She read them back through her memory with great care. The ranch, Duke, the sunrises, the cattle work, his own quiet nature. Not one word about a brother, not one word about a twin. "No," she said, "he did not." Caleb looked down at his boots and then back at her, and his expression now was something clearer. It was embarrassed. "That would be Chester," he said, with what seemed like the remnant of old affection mixed with old frustration. "He doesn't always think to mention things." "Where is Chester?" she asked, because this seemed like the important question. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "He rode out yesterday afternoon. One of the northern fence lines came down in a storm last week, and he's been meaning to get to it. He said he'd be back by mid-morning." He looked at her with that frank, flickering gaze. "I came in from my own place last night to help out this week. I have a smaller spread about 8 miles east." Another pause. "I knew you were coming. I helped him write some of those letters." Something about that last sentence landed in a strange way, and she filed it away to think about later. "You helped him write them," she said. "He's better with cattle than words," Caleb said, and there was something sad and honest in the way he said it. "He asked me to help him sound decent on paper." She did not know what to do with that. She turned back to the sunrise, which was completing its transformation now, the gold going full and ordinary. "Which parts were yours?" she asked. He did not answer right away. Then he said quietly, "The sunrises." She kept looking at the horizon. Her chest felt strange. "He told me he liked to get up before the sun because he liked the way the desert went purple before the light came in." "That's true of both of us," Caleb said, and she heard something careful in his voice, as though he was choosing each word before he set it down. "We grew up here. Same desert, same mornings." Chester returned at mid-morning, as promised, riding in on a roan gelding with dirt on his face and satisfaction in his posture, the posture of a man who had fixed something and felt good about it. He found Harriet in the kitchen garden that ran along the south side of the house, learning which of the raised beds were which from the small hand-written signs stuck in the dirt. He swung down from his horse and walked toward her, and she watched him come across the yard and thought about the letter, thought about the sunrises, thought about Caleb standing in the doorway that morning with those warm, restless eyes. "Miss Alden," Chester said, "sleep all right?" "Very well, thank you," she said. "Your brother was kind enough to explain who he was this morning." Chester had the grace to look briefly discomfited. "Caleb," he said. "Yeah, I meant to mention him." "Did you?" she asked pleasantly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I suppose I kept meaning to and then getting to the next thing. He's harmless. Good man." He looked at her steadily, his gaze that same dark warmth she had registered yesterday, but flatter somehow, more settled, less alive. She pushed the thought away as unkind and probably wrong. "He told me he helped you with the letters," she said. A longer discomfort crossed Chester's face. "Some of them," he said. "The first couple I wrote myself, and I wasn't happy with how they sounded. He's better with that sort of thing." "Which parts were yours?" she asked him, the same question she had asked Caleb. Chester considered. "The cattle work," he said. "What the ranch is like. The practical side of things." She nodded. She watered the nearest bed, which had a sign that said beans in careful letters, and she thought about what it meant that the man she was going to marry on Saturday had described his dog and his ranch and the physical facts of his life, and his twin brother had written the soul of it. She thought about purple mornings and what it meant to love a piece of land. She thought it was possible to be a practical woman and still notice things like that. Saturday arrived before she had properly sorted any of it out. The church in Cutter's Creek smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and the particular dusty sweetness of old hymnals. It was not full. Chester was not a man with a large social circle, and she knew no one, but there were enough people to fill the front rows: ranchers and their wives, the general store owner, the woman who ran the town's small boarding house, a few of the ranch hands. Caleb stood at Chester's right hand as the only attendant, hat in his hands, and Harriet stood across the aisle from her new husband and said the words that the minister required, and Chester said them back in his low, careful voice, and she became Harriet Slater on a bright May morning in 1878, with the smell of desert sage drifting through the open church door. The reception afterward was simple and good. Someone had brought pie. Someone else had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing on the hard-packed earth outside the church, and Harriet danced once with Chester, who moved well enough but kept his eyes somewhere above her left shoulder in a way that she found courteous but oddly distant, and once with Caleb, who looked directly at her the entire time, and who danced with the particular attentiveness of someone who was trying very hard to behave perfectly and finding it necessary to try. She filed that away too. The first weeks of marriage were an education in practical realities. Chester was a good man. She became more certain of that with every day. He worked harder than anyone she had ever seen, rising before dawn and working until dark, and he was never unkind, never rough or demeaning, never the sort of man she had feared in the abstract when she had first read the mail-order bride advertisements. He was generous with food and with rest, and with the small dignities that mattered. He brought her wildflowers once, clumsily, looking embarrassed about it afterward, and she put them in a jar on the windowsill and thanked him sincerely, and he nodded and went back out to the horses. The trouble was the silence. Chester was not unfriendly. He simply did not find words very necessary for most things. Supper might pass with very little conversation, not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well enough not to need words, but the plain silence of a man who had always managed without them and saw no great reason to change. She tried to talk to him about the books she had brought with her, and he listened politely and offered nothing in return. She tried to talk to him about her teaching years in Chicago, and he asked one or two questions and then seemed to feel the conversation had been adequately completed. Caleb came by once a week, sometimes more. He came to help with whatever work Chester was planning, fence repairs or cattle sorting or the maintenance of the well and windmill, and he stayed for supper more often than not, and the supper table on those evenings was entirely different from the other evenings. Caleb talked. He talked about the country, about its history, about the Comanche who had ridden these plains a generation ago, and whose absence from the land was a loss that sat uneasy on him if he thought about it too long, and she found herself grateful that he said it, that he felt the injustice of it, because she had noticed it too, had asked Chester about it once, and received a single-sentence answer that closed rather than opened. Caleb also talked about books he had read, ordered from Santa Fe or traded at the lending shelf in the general store, and she discovered he had read Dickens and Twain and something of Emerson, and he wanted to know what she thought about them, actually wanted to know, and leaned forward slightly when she answered as though she might say something he had not heard before. She could feel herself looking forward to the evenings Caleb came. She noticed it one night in June, washing the supper dishes after Caleb had ridden back to his own place in the warm dark, and Chester had already gone to bed. She noticed that the kitchen felt different after Caleb left, not just quieter, something else. She stood at the basin and looked at the window and the reflection of the lamp in the glass and thought very sternly to herself that she was a married woman, that she had married Chester Slater in good faith and with honest intention, and that whatever she was noticing had nothing to do with anything that could be properly indulged. But she kept noticing. She could not stop herself. She noticed the way Caleb listened, with his whole body, the way he leaned in, and his hands would move slightly when he was engaged. She noticed the way he laughed, which was quick and unguarded, nothing like Chester's infrequent smile. She noticed that he asked her how she was and then waited for an actual answer, and that when she said she was finding the heat harder than she expected, he told her about the river trail through the cottonwoods that was always 10 degrees cooler than the open land, and offered to show her it the next time he came by. She noticed that Chester, standing not 3 feet away, had heard the same exchange and made no comment and no offer of his own. The river trail was everything Caleb had promised. They rode out on a Saturday morning in mid-June, Chester busy with a sick calf that was taking his full attention, and Caleb on his dun gelding beside her borrowed bay. The cottonwoods made a green cathedral over the river path, and the water ran over smooth stones in the flat singing way of shallow rivers, and the air was indeed cooler, smelling of water and growing things, and she breathed it in deeply and felt something in her chest ease that had been tight without her quite realizing it. "You're not happy," Caleb said. He did not say it accusingly. He said it the way someone says the name of something they have been watching carefully and have finally identified. She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't marry for happiness," she said. "I married for a practical future." "That's a sad thing to say," he said. "It's an honest thing to say." "Both can be true," he said, and then looked at the river with a long, considering gaze. "Chester's a good man. I need you to know I believe that." "I know he's a good man," she said. "I've seen it every day." "But," Caleb said, "I didn't say but." "You didn't have to." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and found he was looking back at her with that expression she still did not have a full word for. It was honest and it was careful and it was something else, something that recognized something, the way one person sometimes simply sees another person with an accuracy that takes the breath away. "I should not be having this conversation," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. "Then why are you starting it?" He was quiet for a moment, the dun moving patiently beneath him, the river talking to itself beside them. "Because I've been watching you for 2 months," he said finally, "and I think you came out here expecting something that wasn't quite in the letters, and I think you know that, and I think it isn't fair." "Life is not always fair," she said, which was something her mother had told her and which she had always thought was true but had never enjoyed. "No," he said. "But it doesn't mean we have to pretend it is." She turned the bay and they rode back toward the ranch without speaking further, and the silence between them was nothing like the silence between her and Chester. It was full. It was alive. It was the worst possible kind of problem she could have. She wrote a letter to her friend Margaret back in Chicago that night, sitting at the small writing desk Chester had put in the corner of their bedroom without comment when he had seen her eyeing it. She did not write about Caleb. She wrote about the river trail and the cottonwoods, and the way the heat was different from Chicago heat, drier and thinner, and somehow easier to bear even when it was more extreme. She wrote that she was learning the ranch, which was true. She wrote that she thought she might be all right out here in time, which was also true, but not the whole of it. July brought a problem that shook the comfortable misery of her routine into something sharper. A man named Driscoll, who ran a larger operation some 15 miles north, had been pushing his cattle onto Chester's northern range, using Chester's water and his grass and leaving Chester's fences worse than he found them. Chester had ridden up to speak to Driscoll twice, and both times had come back tight-jawed and saying that the man was unreasonable, and Harriet could see it weighing on him, the physical burden of an injustice he did not know how to resolve without violence, which Chester had no appetite for. Caleb came by when the second confrontation happened and sat at the table with Chester that night, and the two brothers talked it through, their voices low and serious, and she brought them coffee and listened without appearing to listen, and she thought how different they were in this too. Chester's approach was physical, direct, go and say it to the man's face and see what happened. Caleb's was lateral. He talked about the land survey records at the county office in Santa Fe, talked about writing to the territorial land agent, talked about the law and how it could be used when it chose to stand upright. "You go through official channels on this. Driscoll can't come back at you the way he could if it got personal, Caleb said. Chester rubbed his jaw. Takes time. Better than a fight with a man who has more hands and more guns than you do, Caleb said plainly. Chester looked at his brother for a long moment and then nodded, and something passed between them that she recognized as the residue of a lifetime of knowing each other, the brother's shorthand that was deeper than words. She felt a pang of something she identified as envy, not for anything romantic but for the sheer depth of that knowing. And then she was looking at Caleb across the table and he was looking at her, and neither of them looked away for a beat too long. Chester noticed. He said nothing. He picked up his coffee cup, but he noticed. The situation with Driscoll resolved itself more quickly than expected, because the land agent at the county level turned out to have his own grievance against Driscoll for an unrelated matter, and the combination of Chester's filed complaint and Caleb's careful letter writing produced a formal warning that carried enough legal weight to move Driscoll's cattle back where they belonged. Chester shook Caleb's hand when it was settled, and then clapped him once on the shoulder in the way of brothers, and Caleb caught Harriet's eye and gave her a small private smile of satisfaction, and she looked away too quickly and knew that Chester had seen that too. August was hot and brilliant and endless. She had learned to love the early mornings the way Chester had described in the letters, because the letters had been telling the truth even if the truth had come through Caleb's hand. She rose before 5 most days now, made coffee, and sat on the porch steps and watched the purple light come in from the east, and she thought about the particular strangeness of her situation with a clarity that the cool morning air seemed to encourage. She was married to a good man. She was falling in love with his brother. These were the facts, and she was a woman who believed in facing facts directly, no matter how uncomfortable they were. The fact was also that she had done nothing wrong and intended to do nothing wrong, and that what she felt for Caleb was something she had recognized before she was ready to name it, and naming it now did not change anything about what she was going to do, which was nothing. She was Mrs. Chester Slater. That was the whole of it. She was still sitting with that resolution when Chester came out and found her on the porch steps, and instead of going straight to the barn as he usually did, he sat down beside her. He was quiet for a moment, which was his natural state, and then he said without preamble, "I know things haven't been what you expected." She was very still. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm not much for talking," he said. "Never was. I thought the letters might. I thought if I just said enough in the letters to get you to come, then things would work themselves out." She turned to look at him in profile. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was working up to something difficult. "How much of it was you?" she asked quietly. He was quiet for a long time. The purple light was turning to pink at the edges of the sky. "The cattle work," he said. "What the ranch is like. The practical things," a pause, "the feelings, the way the land gets into you, the mornings." That was Caleb. He said it better than I could. "I thought it was still true, and it is true, but it was him," she said. "Yes." She looked at the lightening horizon and felt the truth of it settling over her like water finding its level. Chester had not deceived her maliciously. He had simply understood himself imperfectly, had not grasped that a man who could not find the words to describe his own feelings was perhaps not able to provide them either. He was exactly what the letter's practical content described. The rest, the depth and the warmth and the reaching quality of the writing had come from somewhere else. "Chester," she said carefully, "are you happy?" He considered the question with the same slow attention he gave everything. "I wanted a wife," he said. "Figured it was time. Needed someone to help run this place and thought you'd do. I think you're a fine woman." He paused. "But I think you want things I don't know how to give you." The directness of it startled her. He was blunter than she had given him credit for when he finally decided to speak. "What kind of things?" she asked. "Talking," he said, with a kind of rueful self-awareness that she had not seen before. "You like to talk about things, big things, books and ideas and what things mean. I don't. That's not something I know how to do." "It's all right," she said and meant it as comfort, but he shook his head. "It's not though," he said. "Not for you." Another pause, and now she could see him working up to the hardest thing. I see how you look when Caleb's here, and I see how he looks at you." She felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the approaching day. "Nothing has happened," she said. "Nothing will happen." "I know it," he said. He did not say it with anger. He said it as a statement of fact, which in a way was worse, because he was right and she knew he was right, and she also knew that the nothing happening was a kind of constant, sustained effort on a level he was not even asking about. But something could if things were different. "Things are not different," she said. He nodded slowly. He was quiet so long that the sky went from pink to gold and a mockingbird started up somewhere near the barn. Then he said, "I've been thinking, since the Driscoll business. Caleb's a better man for a lot of things than I am. Different kind of man." "Don't," she said, because she could see where he was heading and it frightened her in a way she did not quite understand. "I'm not saying it against myself," he said, with a dignity that made her throat hurt. "I'm just saying what's true. I know my own nature." He looked at her directly. "You deserve the life the letters promised. Even if I didn't write them." She did not know what to say. She looked at her hands, at the rough places on her palms that were rougher now from ranch work, and she thought about the hard patience of being honest with yourself in the early morning when the light is still purple and nothing has committed itself to being anything yet. "What are you suggesting?" she finally asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm just saying I see it." He stood up, settled his hat on his head, and looked down at her for a moment with that steady dark gaze that was so like Caleb's and so different. "You're a good woman, Harriet. Better than I deserve to get." He walked to the barn. She sat on the steps for a long time after that, and the mockingbird sang and the windmill turned, and she felt the whole complicated weight of her situation pressing down on her, and could not decide whether what she felt was grief or relief or some entirely new emotion that the English language had failed to provide a word for. She kept going. What else could she do? She was a practical woman. September brought the cattle drive preparations, and the ranch came alive with additional hands and the noise and smell of serious livestock work. Chester was in his element, tireless and sure, a man who communicated perfectly with horses and cattle even if he struggled with people, and she watched him with a complicated admiration. He was truly good at this. The land was his in a way she understood better now, having spent 4 months on it. Whatever else was or was not between them, that love of the land was real and she had grown into it herself, unexpectedly, the way the letters had predicted. Caleb came to help with the drive preparation, and they were all busy enough that the careful, complicated dance of the three of them was subsumed into the simpler animal urgency of work. She learned to help with branding records, keeping the tally book, and discovered she was good at it. Caleb, working a fence beside the sorting corral, looked up and caught her eye across 50 feet of organized chaos and grinned at her, and she grinned back before she thought about it, and then went back to her tally book with the pen pressed a little harder into the paper than necessary. Chester saw it. He always saw it. She was beginning to understand. Chester was not a talker, but he was an observer, and he missed very little. That evening, after supper, he did something she had not expected. He asked Caleb to stay, and when the supper things were cleared and she was settling by the lamp with a book, he said to both of them with the blunt, careful directness that was beginning to seem like his truest form of honesty, "I've been in conversation with myself for a few months now. I want to say something and I want you both to hear it." She set down her book. Caleb, who had been rolling a cigarette, stopped and looked at his brother. "I married Harriet in good faith," Chester said. "And she came here in good faith. But I think we both made a mistake that wasn't about bad intentions. I'm not the man the letters described." He looked at Caleb. "You are." The silence in the room was a specific and very dense silence. "Chester," Caleb said. His voice was careful and quiet, the voice of a man who is keeping himself very controlled. "I'm not angry," Chester said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm being honest with myself, which is harder than being angry. I knew when we started writing those letters that you could say things better than me. I thought it was just words. I see now it wasn't just words. It was the way you are, the way you see things." That's what I was borrowing, and it wasn't mine to borrow. You wrote honestly about your ranch and your life, Harriet said, because she felt it needed saying. I did, Chester said. But a woman coming to marry a man needs to know the whole man, not the parts he's good at, the whole thing. He looked at her with that steady gaze. You're a good woman, Harriet, and I want you to be happy. I don't think I'm able to make you happy the way you need. I think we both know it by now. The crackling fire and the lamp and the vast dark outside the windows seemed to contract the room around them. She felt her heart beating very loudly. What are you saying exactly? Caleb asked, and his voice was still very controlled, still very careful. I'm saying, Chester said, with a heavy and deliberate slowness, that I think the right thing, if we are all brave enough for it, is an honest conversation about what each of us actually wants, and that you should not feel as though you have done something wrong by caring for her, because I can see that you have tried hard not to. He looked at Harriet. And you should not feel as though you have done something wrong by caring for him, because I have eyes. The room was very quiet. A log shifted in the fireplace. Chester, Harriet said, and her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. An annulment is not a simple thing. And it would be the talk of this whole county, and people would say terrible things, and I do not want you to sacrifice your dignity for what's right, Chester said. I've been thinking about what my grandfather would have said. He was a hard man, but an honest one. He would have said that the hardest kind of right is the kind that costs you something. He picked up his coffee cup. I'm not doing this tonight. There's no need to do anything tonight. But I'm saying what I see, and I'm saying I'd rather live with a truth that costs something than a comfortable lie that costs more in the end. Caleb stood up. He put his hat on with deliberate movements, and she could see the effort he was making to hold himself still. I need to ride home, he said. I need to think. Think all you need to, Chester said without rancor. Caleb went to the door and then stopped and looked back at both of them, and there was something in his face that she thought she might not forget for the rest of her life. It was a man in the full grip of something enormous, love and guilt and hope all at war with each other, and it was very beautiful and very painful to see. He put his hand on the doorframe for a moment, and then he went out, and they heard his horse move away in the dark. She and Chester sat in silence for a while, and then she said, "You're a better man than most people would be in this situation." He considered this with his usual slow deliberateness. "I don't know about better," he said. "I know what it feels like to be in a marriage where both people are making the best of something that isn't quite right. I grew up watching that, my parents." He looked at the fire. "I don't want that." She thought about her own parents, who had been reasonably content, reasonably fond, which she now understood was perhaps not the highest bar. She thought about Caleb on his horse in the dark, riding home through the desert night, thinking. She thought about what it meant to be a practical woman in an impractical situation. "I married you," she said. "I meant those vows." "I know it," he said. "I'm not asking you to unmean them. I'm not asking anything tonight." He stood up. "I'm going to bed. You think on what you want, not what's expected, what you actually want." She sat by the lamp for a long time after he had gone, her book unopened on her lap, and the fire burned down, and the desert night pressed its enormous quiet against the windows, and she thought very hard about what she actually wanted. What she wanted, she admitted to herself in the small dark hours, was Caleb Slater. She had wanted him since the morning on the porch when she had looked at the same face. She was married too, and found the whole world different inside it. She had wanted him when he talked about the Comanche and the lost country with that uneasy conscience that she found as attractive as anything physical. She had wanted him when he stood at the river and said things were not fair and did not pretend otherwise. She had wanted him for months and had been building a case against the wanting every day, brick by careful brick, and Chester had just knocked it down in a single quiet conversation. She was not sure whether to be grateful or terrified. She slept eventually, and in the morning Chester was up before her as usual, and when she came out to the porch with her coffee, he was already at the corrals, and everything looked exactly the same as it had been, which she supposed was true of a great many things that had shifted permanently beneath the surface. Caleb came back 2 days later. He came at mid-morning on a Wednesday, when Chester was out on the range with two of the hands, and she was in the kitchen garden pulling beans with the focused attention of a woman who is using physical work to keep her thoughts orderly. She heard his horse and looked up, and he dismounted and tied the dun to the post and came through the garden gate with his hat in his hand. "I need to speak with you," he said. "I thought you might," she said. She straightened and brushed the dirt from her hands. He stood with his hat going through his fingers in a slow, restless rotation. "I've spent 2 days thinking about right and wrong," he said. "About what I owe Chester. About the fact that you are his wife and that I have felt things I had no right to feel." "Have you resolved anything?" she asked. "Only this," he said. He stopped turning the hat. He looked at her very directly, with that warm and searching gaze that she had recognized from the first morning and had been trying not to know for 6 months. "I love you. I am aware that I should not. I am aware that it complicates everything. I am aware that you are Chester's wife and that there are proper and decent ways of being in this world, and that what I am telling you is not among them in any normal circumstance." He took a breath. "But Chester sat me down at that table and told me the truth about the letters and told me he could see what was happening, and he asked me to be honest. So I'm being honest. I love you." She stood in the kitchen garden with bean plants at her knees and the September sun on her face and this man telling her he loved her, and she thought she had been right that she was not a romantic, because a romantic would probably be crying by now, and she was not crying. She felt something large and warm and very certain move through her chest like sunlight through water, and she thought, "Yes, there it is. That is what it is supposed to feel like." "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying very hard not to, and I have been failing at it since June." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath. He took one step toward her and then stopped, still holding the hat, still being careful, still being the most maddeningly decent man she had encountered in her life. "I'm not going to," he started. "I know," she said. "Chester and I need to talk first," he said. "I know. And there are legal considerations. An annulment is a long business and it requires grounds, and I don't know what grounds Chester would." "I know," she said again, more firmly. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and they stood in the September garden in a kind of suspended brightness. That was the most intimate thing she had experienced since coming to New Mexico. And neither of them moved toward the other, because they were both, in their different ways, committed to doing this properly. Chester came in at midday and found Caleb sitting on the porch, hat on his knee, and Harriet in the kitchen making lunch. And he stood in the yard for a moment and looked at his brother, and something passed between the twin faces that was old and deep, and beyond what she could follow from the kitchen window. Then Chester walked up on the porch and sat down, and the two brothers talked for a long time in low voices while she worked. And when they came in for lunch, they were both quiet, but it was a different quality of quiet. It was settled. Chester told her that afternoon, when Caleb had gone back to his place, and she was at the writing desk working through the household accounts, that he had spoken to the minister about the legal possibilities. He said it with his characteristic plainness, without drama or self-pity, the way he said most things. He said that the minister had told him that in the territory, an annulment could be pursued on grounds of incompatibility of intention, which was a thing he had not known existed as grounds, but which apparently did, at least in some circumstances, and with the cooperation of both parties. "You'd need to agree to it," he said. "Both of us would have to agree and present ourselves to the county judge." "Chester," she said, and stopped. "What?" he said. "Are you certain this is what you want? Not what you think is right for us, what you want." He was quiet for a while. He looked out the window at the corrals and the range beyond. "I want," he said slowly, "to live honestly. That's what I want. I want to get up in the morning and know I'm living the life I'm actually in, not the life I'm pretending to be in." He looked at her. "I think you and Caleb are the life I'm pretending to be in, and I think I'd like to stop pretending." It took 6 weeks. There were forms and a trip to the county seat, and a conversation with a judge who was initially skeptical and then, hearing Chester's plain and honest account, became simply sad in a way that seemed professional and then human in quick succession. The annulment was granted in late October. She was not sure what she expected to feel when the judge signed the document, and she was no longer Mrs. Chester Slater, but what she felt was something like standing at the edge of a very large open space and seeing that it goes all the way to the horizon and realizing you are allowed to walk into it. Chester shook her hand when they walked out of the courthouse. He shook Caleb's too. He held Caleb's hand for a moment longer than a regular handshake. "You'll look after her," he said. "I will," Caleb said. "And you'll stop letting the east fence of your place go to ruin. Come ask me for help when it needs it." Caleb laughed at that, quickly and without guarding it, and Chester's face did something that was almost a smile, and she thought that whatever else happened in her life, she would remember this moment as one of the more extraordinary she had been present for. Two brothers, standing on the steps of a county courthouse in the New Mexico Territory in 1878, working out the terms of an impossible situation with more grace than most people brought to ordinary ones. She and Caleb were married on a Thursday in December, which was a mild day for December in that country. The sky, a deep winter blue, and the air carrying the faint cold edge of the mountains to the north. The minister was the same one who had married her to Chester, and he performed the ceremony with a professional even-handedness that she admired. And if there was any community talk about the peculiarity of the arrangement, it was conducted at a volume she could not hear and did not go looking for. Chester was there. He stood at the back of the church, hat in hand, and when she walked past him she met his eyes, and he gave her a single nod that meant several things she understood without needing them spelled out. She nodded back. The wedding supper was at Caleb's place, which was smaller than Chester's but had been cleaned within an inch of its life and decorated with juniper branches and whatever late-season wildflowers could be found, and when she walked through the door and saw what he had done with it, she felt the warmth move through her chest again, that certainty she had felt in the garden. "You swept the floor," she said. "Several times," he said, "and those are candles on the table. I rode to town twice for candles." She looked at him, this man who had helped write the soul of letters that had brought her here, who had felt things he thought he had no right to feel, and had gone away and thought about right and wrong for 2 days before coming back to tell her the truth, who had ridden to town twice for candles. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and put her hands on his face and kissed him properly, for the first time, and he kissed her back with the full attention of a man who has been waiting a very long time and intends to do this right. The winter was the most beautiful of her life. She learned his house and he learned her presence in it, the particular way she liked to arrange things, and the books she kept on the small table beside the bed, and the fact that she sang to herself when she was working, just under her breath, old songs from Illinois that she had never thought of as significant until he mentioned one evening that he had started to listen for them when she was in the next room. She taught him things and he taught her things. She taught him some of the history she had read, the larger world beyond the territory, and he taught her to read the land the way he read it, the tracks and signs, and the language that the desert spoke if you were patient enough to listen. He took her to places he had not taken anyone, a canyon east of his land where ancient people had painted red ochre figures on the cliff walls, figures of deer and hands and the shapes of things she could not name, and they stood before them in the winter light, and she felt the weight of all the years they represented and reached for his hand without thinking, and he took it with the same natural certainty. They talked every evening. Not about nothing, but about everything, the way people do when they are genuinely curious about each other's minds, and find the conversation better each time instead of wearing thin. She told him about her childhood in Illinois, her father who had died when she was 12, and the particular loneliness of a house after a large presence leaves it. He told her about growing up twin, the strange doubled life of it, always beside someone who was also you and also entirely not you, and how he had loved Chester fiercely and sometimes found the similarity suffocating, and how Chester felt the same, and how they had found a way to be genuinely separate people from the same starting material. "Do you think you'll be all right?" she asked one evening. It was January, and there was a fire in the small stone fireplace, and she was sitting in the chair he had brought back from town for her, which was better than the other chairs, and he noticed every time she sat in it. "Chester," he looked at the fire. "I think he'll be more than all right. I think Chester, without the complication of trying to be something he isn't, is a man who can breathe easier. He knows this land the way he knows his own bones. He'll find a woman who wants exactly what he is, and it'll be good for both of them." "You sound certain," she said. "I know my brother," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "You've been thinking about right and wrong your whole life, haven't you?" she said. It was not quite a question. He smiled at the fire. "Since I was about 7. I took an apple from the Harding orchard on a dare and couldn't sleep for a week. And the apple wasn't even good," he said. "That was the worst part." She laughed, and he looked at her with that warmth she had gotten used to and thought she would never get entirely used to. Because it was the kind of warmth that felt new every time, like the desert mornings that were the same light every day and somehow always astonishing. Spring came the way it comes in that country, not gently but suddenly, the desert blooming up into improbable color after the winter rains, prickly pear opening yellow flowers, ocotillo going red at the tips, the river running higher and faster. She went with him in April to check the cattle on the East Range, and they rode through country that was doing its annual best, and she thought that the land had indeed gotten into her, exactly the way the letter had promised, and that it had happened so thoroughly she could not imagine Chicago anymore except as a foreign country she had visited. She told him in May that she was pregnant. He was standing at the corral gate when she told him, had been working with a young horse, and he went very still for a moment with his hands on the fence post, and then he turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was a man receiving the thing he did not know he had been waiting for, and it was a very good thing to see. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am sure," she said. He crossed the space between them and took her face in both his hands carefully, the way he had handled everything from the beginning, with that deliberate, gentle certainty, and he kissed her forehead and then stood with his forehead against hers for a moment in the morning air, and she could feel him breathing. "All right," he said finally. "All right. We have months to talk about everything," she said. "The room on the east side would be best, more light in the mornings." "Caleb, what?" "We have months," he breathed a laugh. "All right," he said again. "All right, come here." He pulled her in and held her with the solid warmth of a man who means every gesture he makes, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the whole weight of the year just past, and what it had cost, and what it had given back, and she thought that being a practical woman in an impractical situation had perhaps turned out better than she deserved. Chester came to visit in June when she was beginning to show, and he sat on the porch with them in the evening and drank coffee and talked about his cattle operation in the specific, satisfied way of a man whose problems are the right kind of problems, the kind he knows how to solve. He had hired a new hand who was proving his worth. He was thinking of adding to his herd by the fall. He had made peace with the Driscoll situation in the particular way of a man who has put it in the past. She noticed that he seemed lighter. Caleb had been right. Chester, without the strain of trying to be more than he was, had a looseness to his shoulders and a directness to his gaze that she had only glimpsed before. He was not a man who was going to be lonely. He was a man who was genuinely comfortable alone, which was a different thing entirely. "You look well," she told him. "Good summer," he said. "Going to be a good fall." He looked at her, at the evidence of the pregnancy she was wearing without apology, and he said, with a simplicity that was entirely his own and entirely real, "I'm glad for both of you." She believed him. The baby came in November, in the cold, clear days of early winter when the sky was the color of gunmetal and the desert smelled of wood smoke and cold stone. He was born in the bedroom where the east window let in the morning light, delivered by the doctor from town who rode out in a wagon and arrived with professional calm and the kind of steady reassurance she was grateful for. Caleb was in the kitchen. She could hear him moving back and forth, and when it was over and the baby was placed in her arms, the doctor went out and told him, and she heard him make that sound again, the one between a laugh and a breath, and then he came through the door and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that was entirely new on his face. "A boy," she said. He reached out and touched the baby's face with one finger, the lightest possible touch. "A boy," he said. His voice was very quiet. She looked at him and saw that he was crying just slightly, without embarrassment or effort to conceal it, the way a man cries when something is simply too large to be held inside in the usual way. They named him Thomas, after Caleb's grandfather, who had come to this country from Virginia and had broken the land with his hands and left it to his sons. Thomas was a serious baby who regarded the world with large brown eyes that were already his father's eyes, and who made his preferences clear on all subjects with a directness that she thought came from both of them. Chester came to meet him on a Sunday in December and sat with the baby in his arms with a careful awkwardness that made Caleb smile, and said that he was a fine-looking boy and that he had the Slater jaw, which was true, and she said she hoped the jaw had not inherited the Slater reluctance to talk, and Chester looked at her with that almost smile. "Might," he said. "You'll manage it." "I always have," she said. Life went on, in the way that life does in a place where the seasons are dramatic and the work is real, and the days have a weight and texture that the city never managed. She found her place in it, found the particular shape of the woman she was out here as distinct from the woman she had been in Illinois. And the two were not so different except that this one was outdoors more and worried less, and had a larger sky to live under and a man who loved her in the specific and particular way that she had needed without knowing she needed it, entirely and with his whole attention, the way he did everything. She taught herself to ride better, with Caleb's patient instruction and the occasional outright laughter when she made mistakes, and by the second spring she could go out alone on the bay and be gone for 2 hours without anyone worrying. She rode the river trail regularly, the one he had first told her about, the one that was always cooler in the heat, and sometimes she took Thomas when he was old enough, sitting in front of her on the saddle, and pointed out the things she had learned the names of, the cottonwood and the willow and the red-tailed hawk that lived near the bend in the river, and always seemed to be watching the same patch of sky. In the summer of 1880, Thomas was 8 months old and walking along the furniture with the determined locomotion of a person who has made up his mind about mobility, and she told Caleb that there would be a second one coming, and this time he was not by the corral but in the kitchen, standing at the stove, and he turned around and just looked at her for a long moment. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Good," she said. "Better than last time in the beginning." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, properly and completely, and then leaned his cheek against her hair. "Thomas is going to have opinions about this," he said. "Thomas has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by it honestly." "From which of us?" "Both," she said. He laughed, the quick unguarded laugh that she had loved since the beginning, since before she was allowed to love anything about him, and she thought that she had made a full and complicated journey to get here, to this kitchen in New Mexico with her son navigating the furniture and this man's laugh filling the room, and that it had been worth every strange and difficult step. The second child was a girl. She arrived in February of 1881, which was a harder birth than Thomas, but she came into the world with her lungs fully operational and her opinions already formed, and they named her Ruth, after Harriet's own mother, and she had red hair the color of old copper that clearly came from no Slater and everything Alden, and Caleb looked at it with complete delight, and said he had not known that was in the possibility, and that he found it entirely wonderful. Thomas greeted his sister with the intense suspicious interest of a 1-year-old confronted with a small rival, and then settled into a watchful tolerance that Harriet thought would become protection in time. Caleb watched his children the way he watched everything that mattered to him, steadily and with his full attention, and she would sometimes come into the room and find him sitting with Ruth on his lap and Thomas on the floor between his feet, just watching them exist, as though the watching were itself sufficient occupation. Chester remained a constant presence in their lives, coming by monthly at minimum, and he turned out to be a very good uncle in the specific way that men who are not natural fathers sometimes are, direct with the children, willing to take them out to the corrals and show them things, honest about what horses will and will not tolerate. Thomas adored him with the passionate and uncomplicated affection of a small child for a large, patient man, and Chester bore this with the same steady dignity he brought to everything. In the fall of 1881, Chester met a woman named Clara Walsh, who had come to Cutter's Creek with her widowed father and her two younger sisters, and who was capable and plain-spoken, and who found Chester's quietness comfortable rather than difficult because she, too, was a person who preferred doing things to talking about them. He told Caleb about her with characteristic economy, said simply that he thought she was a good woman and that he was considering courting her. Caleb told him that was the best news he had heard in some time. Chester said he thought so too. Clara Walsh and Chester Slater were married in the spring of 1882, and the wedding was held on a Saturday with a better fiddle player than the one at Harriet's first wedding, and a larger crowd, because Chester had more connections by now, and Harriet stood in the gathering with Thomas on her hip and Ruth on Caleb's, and watched Chester say his vows to a woman who was looking at him with an expression of complete and practical certainty, and she thought that everything in the end had sorted itself into its proper shape. Clara was good for Chester in exactly the ways that Chester needed and Harriet had not been. She was not a reader or a debater. She was a woman of enormous physical capability and dry humor, and she communicated with Chester in the vocabulary of work and proximity, and the small practical exchanges of daily life, and Chester visibly expanded in her company, the way a plant expands when it gets the right kind of light. By the following year, Clara was pregnant with their first child, a boy they named Henry, and Chester stood at the church in town holding his son with an expression that Harriet recognized, had seen on Caleb's face in the east bedroom, and understood to be a man receiving more than he expected. She told Caleb about it on the ride home, with Thomas asleep against her shoulder and Ruth doing the same against his, the horses walking slowly through the warm evening air. "Chester looked the way you looked," she said. "When Thomas was born." He looked over at her across the space between the horses. "You saw that, did you?" "I see most things," she said. "So you do," he said with that warmth. He reached over and put his hand briefly over hers on the reins. "Good for him. Good for Clara. Good for that baby." "Good for everyone," she said. "Good for everyone," he agreed. The years that followed were the ones she had not dared to imagine when she had sat in a Chicago boarding house reading an advertisement about a New Mexico rancher. They were years of work and weather and children growing, of cattle seasons and difficult winters, and the particular pleasure of knowing a place so well that you could navigate it in the dark by feel alone. They were years of conversation, evenings on the porch when the children were in bed, and the stars were out in their hundreds, and they talked about everything still, about the books she ordered from Santa Fe, and the changing shape of the territory as it worked toward statehood, and the quiet, everyday philosophy of two people who had found each other by an improbable route, and were grateful for the finding. Thomas grew into a boy who was his father in most ways, but had his mother's gift for reading, which Caleb encouraged with the particular pleasure of a man who wants his child to have everything he values. Ruth grew into a girl who rode better than either of her parents by the time she was 6, which made Caleb proud and Harriet only slightly nervous, and who had opinions on every subject that she expressed without waiting to be asked, which made everyone who knew the family smile. She was, as Caleb said, entirely her mother's daughter, which he said as the highest possible compliment, and meant it that way. There was a third child, a boy they named James, in 1883, born in August in the heat that even 15 years of desert living had not made her entirely immune to. But he arrived easily and with good humor, and settled into the family like a stone that had always been in its right place. He was a quiet child, which surprised everyone who had met his parents, with a pensive watchfulness that Caleb said was the Slater nature finding its way back in, and which Harriet said was fine with her as long as he talked to people when he needed to. She wrote to Margaret in Chicago regularly across all these years, long letters that described the ranch and the children and the landscape and the life, and Margaret's replies were fond and slightly bewildered, because the woman she read about in these letters was both recognizably Harriet and also someone larger than the person who had left Illinois in 1878. She had grown into this place the way Caleb had said she would, the way the letter had promised in the words she now knew were his, and it had grown into her in return, until the distinction between her and the red rock country and the enormous sky and the river with its cottonwoods and the ranch with its windmill and its horses was not a sharp one. One evening in the spring of 1884, when Thomas was 3.5 and Ruth was 2, and James was 8 months, and the yard was full of the late light of an April sunset that was doing its best work in orange and gold, she and Caleb sat on the porch as they always did after supper, and she was watching the colors change in the western sky, and he was watching her watch them, which she knew without looking because she knew him by now the way you know a piece of land you have walked over in every season. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered the question as she always did honestly. "I'm thinking about the letter," she said, "the first one. And you wrote about getting up before the sun because you liked the way the desert went purple before the light came in," he said. "I thought it was Chester who felt that," she said. "For a long time I thought the feeling was his and only the words were yours. And now," he said, "now I know the feeling was yours too," she said, "and the words, and you were just too decent to say so." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sunset alongside her. "I should have told you sooner," he said, "when you arrived. I should have told you outright that the letters were mine and let you decide." "If you had," she said, "I would have been very confused and then probably gotten on the next stage back to Santa Fe." "Possibly," he said. "Certainly," she said. He smiled at the horizon. "So it worked out." "In the most complicated possible way," she said. "I find the complicated ways are usually the real ones," he said. She looked at him then, at this man she had not married first, the man she had loved by mistake and then by intention, and then by the whole settled weight of years and children and the choosing of each day, and she thought that he was right about that. The real things were never the easy ones. The easy path would have been to stay in Chicago and marry the pharmacist's son, who had been pursuing her with persistent politeness and no particular feeling. The easy path would have been to stay married to Chester and make the best of it, and learn not to want what she actually wanted. She had not taken the easy path, not by choice, but by the accumulation of 100 small and honest moments, and she was glad of it every morning when the desert went purple before the light came in. "Come here," Caleb said, and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him on the porch bench, and the children were quiet inside, an improbable mercy, and the sky went from orange to red to the deep violet of the coming night, and the first stars appeared, sharp and bright and unhurried in the way of things that have always been there. "I love you," he said. He still said it the way he had said it the first time in the kitchen garden, as though it were the weight of a real thing, not a formula. "I love you," she said back, and meant it in the same way, with all the ordinary and extraordinary substance of a life genuinely shared. Somewhere in the corrals, one of the horses called out in the dark. Somewhere to the east, the river was doing its unchanging work over its smooth stones. The windmill turned. She thought, "I came out here on a train that smelled of coal smoke and hope. I had a carpet bag and a practical heart and a letter from a man who turned out to be half of the man I needed. I stood in the street of a small desert town and thought all right, then all right, and I was not wrong, only early. Only arriving before I had found the right door. She thought, the wrong one. Nobody warned her the husband had a twin. Nobody warned her she would love the wrong one. But sitting on this porch in the April dark, with the stars coming out and the children breathing in their beds and this man's arm around her, she had decided something that she held firmly and without question. There was no wrong one. There had only ever been the right one, and the getting to him had taken the longer road. The longer road was the one with everything worth having on it. In the years afterward, when Thomas was old enough to understand stories and asked about the beginning, about how she and his father had come to be at this ranch on this land, she told him the honest version, which was also the complicated version, and she did not simplify it for his age but trusted him to hold the complexity of it. She told him that she had come from Chicago on a train to marry a man she had never met, and that when she arrived, the desert was so large, and the sky was so enormous that she understood immediately that simple things were not what this country was built for. She told him that she had married his Uncle Chester in good faith and that his Uncle Chester was a good man, which was true. She told him that she had fallen in love with his father without meaning to, and that his father had felt the same, and that his Uncle Chester, being the kind of man he was, had made it possible for the right thing to happen, which was the bravest kind of right because it cost him something. Thomas listened with the serious attention he brought to everything, and then he said, "Did it hurt when you figured it out?" And she said, "Yes, but the best things usually cost something first." He thought about this for a while, in the way he had of going away into himself with a question. Then he said, "I think Uncle Chester is happy now." "He is," she said, "and so am I, and so is your father. All of it settled the way it was supposed to." "Good," Thomas said, with the confident simplicity of a child who does not yet know how rare that is, and went back to the book he was reading, and she looked at him reading in the lamp light and felt the particular gratitude that has no adequate name. Caleb found her sitting there a while later, watching their son, and he stood in the doorway and looked at both of them and said, "What are you two doing?" "Talking," Thomas said, without looking up from his book. "About what?" "The beginning," Harriet said. Caleb leaned against the doorframe in the easy posture of a man who is entirely at home in the place he is standing, and he looked at her across the lamplit room, and she looked back at him, and between them passed something that required no translation, the understanding of two people who have been genuinely known by each other for long enough that the knowing has become the foundation everything else stands on. "Good beginning," he said. "The best," she said. Ruth called from the next room, wanting something with the directness of a person untroubled by self-editing, and James woke up sympathetically from his cradle, and Thomas put down his book and made the face of an older sibling imposed upon, and Caleb laughed and she laughed, and the lamp burned its steady yellow light, and the desert held them all in its enormous and indifferent and deeply particular way, and everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved. And everything that had needed to be found was found, and the night settled over the ranch the way nights have settled over good places since before anyone was there to notice them. In the morning the desert would go purple before the light came in. She would be there for it. So would he.